All right, welcome. We're going to start chapter 4. Um, this is going to begin a bit of a transition. We're going to be moving from setting up the entire structure. So we talked about criminological theory in the last couple chapters. We talked about data. Well, here we're going to really begin a unit on one of the components, one of the three chief components of the criminal justice system, and that's going to be the police. So, we're going to, in order to understand the police, look at their history. We're going to try to play a little catch up. After a history, we're going to look at the current structure so that we have some concept of what's going on today. All right, so let's jump in. The first thing is going to be those learning objectives. They're not particularly critical immediately. These are all just general ideas that we're trying to learn. It's not the worst idea to keep these in the back of your mind and to understand that's what I'm trying to do here, but those are, a lot of that is just to give you a familiarization what I'm seeking to accomplish in this chapter. Okay, so the first thing is your book is going to, and I'm going to, talk about 4 primary responsibilities of the police. Now, those are going to be enforcing the law, providing service, preventing crime, preserving the peace. So, number 1, enforcing the law. This is an ideal that many Americans, I think, instinctively have. The idea that the police are supposed to enforce the law. They're supposed to be neutral. They're supposed to be not on his side, not on my side, but on the side of truth and justice the American way, with all apologies to Superman. In fact, I think even some police officers see themselves this way if you ask them in the heart of hearts, and I think that's a noble idea. But in truth, police officers spend actually very little time doing this. If we look at the breakdown of what the police do, the actual time they're out there enforcing the law is relatively small. So what do? It's a fair question. I think the next major responsibility answers that, and that's providing services. So if you were to drive around in the area, on a Sunday, let's say, you'd notice that as the churches or synagogues, or mosques or synagogues are letting out, you often will see police officers directing traffic. And that is a service the police provide almost everywhere. If you did this on a Saturday or a Friday night and you were at a football game or you were at a basketball game, because we're in basketball country, or even at a professional hockey game with the Canes, you would see the police directing traffic. So a lot of what the police do, and it's probably the largest single thing they do, is they provide these services to the public, not directly related to fighting crime. So they can do things like rescue, they can do things like searches for lost children, they can do things like directing traffic. All of these are good examples. The third is preventing crime. And I've said this, I think I mentioned it before, but I'll mention it several times. The most effective, the best police department in the world is not the police department that catches criminals. That's great. All police departments have to do that, don't get me wrong. But it's good if the guy that steals your wallet or takes your purse gets caught. It's better if your wallet never gets stolen in the first place. So the ideal, the best police department is the one that is so effective that there is no crime. And obviously this is an ideal that can only be approached. The fourth thing, and this is related to preventing crime, is preserving peace. Police cannot enforce every law. They can't provide every service. They can't prevent every crime. But one of the things they have to do is handle situations. Police officers, we give them discretion. Should they enforce the law at this moment? Should they do this at this moment? how should they handle the situation? Um, if a police officer is insulted, um, should he get mad? Should he get violent? Should he handle the situation by taking what people say? I can't tell you how many times I've heard from clients, oh yeah, I gave that cop a piece of my mind. You know, I told him that I pay taxes and that pays his salary. And I'm going to tell you, police hear that and are sick of hearing it. And they could react very badly to it. But most of the time they don't. Most of the time they handle the situation by saying, I understand that, sir, but you were speeding and I'm sorry, you know, here's your ticket. Having said there's 4 there, I do think we should remember that, and you should remember, that anytime someone gives a list, particularly a short list, and they say these are the 4 reasons or the 2 reasons why this happens, you should ask questions. You should say, really, is that all 4? Aren't there other things that the police do? Aren't there other things that whoever you're talking about do? And this is where you have to challenge the presentation of information. You should challenge what I'm telling you. You should challenge what your book is telling you. Now, not all responsibilities are obvious or even stated overtly. One of the things the police are clearly doing is they are protecting the status quo. They are protecting the existence of society as it is now. Who's in charge? Who's the workers? Who's the owners? Who's on top? Who's on bottom? The police are the mechanism, whereas if force is needed to maintain this, short of the military, that's who you turn to. The second thing that wasn't really talked about is enforcing a moral code. The police represent, or should represent, an idealized version of what we expect out of the government morally. So sometimes this is very, very positive. So, for example, if a child is being abused, we expect, if necessary, the police can physically go in and rescue the child. If a child is missing, we expect, all right, the police can look for a child. So we expect positive enforcement. Now, sometimes we expect the police to do our dirty work in an ugly way, in a negative way. So if we went back to the bad old days of racial segregation in the United States, the so-called Jim Crow laws, those laws had to be enforced, and the mechanism we enforced them with was the police. And that was the enforcing of a moral code that had become statutory law. So there are other things the police do. They advance political, economic, and social interests. All of those are important to understand how and why the police function in the way they do. All right, a short history of American policing. One of the things that surprises students when I discuss this is if I was to put up a slide of Raleigh 100 years ago in 1920, you'd see a very small city, far fewer than 100,000, far fewer than 50,000. If I went back another 100 years, if I went back to the 1820s, you'd see a tiny city. You'd see something that is smaller than Fuquay-Varina today, or Garner. You'd see something that had 10,000 people in it, or 5,000 people in it, depending how far we live. One of the things that is true about recent history is that a couple hundred years ago, almost everybody lived in the countryside. The rural population was very large. Cities were very small and very infrequent in the United States. Now, it's not to say there wasn't any mechanism of law enforcement, but there were no police, not until the middle part of the 1800s. There was a watch system where adult members of a small community would provide services and protect the community. But as the cities got bigger, as Raleigh went from a few hundred to a few thousand to a few tens of thousands to more than 100,000, it became obvious that the old systems weren't going to work, that you had to have something. Now, we're not going to go too far into the history of different departments, but the sheriff had always been around. The term sheriff is originally shire-reeve, sheriff. The shires were the name of the counties in England. The reeve was an important official, R-E-E-V-E, so shire-reeve, important official of the county. But again, they were a rural force. Sheriffs were very much rural. They weren't urban. So when the cities develop, often inside these counties, the question is, well, who's going to do the policing? We see in America kind of a clear split. The sheriffs in the rural areas, and there were other manifestations of this. If you go out to the West, during the settling of the West, you've all, I'm sure, seen a Western. You've seen posses, where the sheriff says, all right, boys, we're going to round up people and we're going to go hunt the bad guys. Let's go catch Butch Scatchity and Sundance Kid or Jesse James or whoever. You also saw very much in a rural area slave patrols in the American South. So when the laws against of slavery were trying to be enforced, the slaves would run away, and in order to stop this, there had to be a mechanism, and these patrols started in the United States, became very common, very powerful, and a real part of law enforcement for a while. But as well as having these kind of older systems and these posses and slave patrols grow up, we have the emergence of the great American cities. So picture a map in your mind, and the big cities at first would be, first Philadelphia was the largest city, but we were soon surpassed by New York City. And New York remains the largest city in the United States today. But there were other large cities, most of which were located on the coast, and typically also in the north. There were occasional exceptions to that rule. For example, Pittsburgh becomes a large city and it's not a coastal city. Philadelphia is, believe it or not, a coastal city. It has a port. New York is, New Jersey is, Boston is, Providence is, Baltimore is. Even the southern large cities, Charleston and New Orleans, are ports. So it takes a while for these cities to get large. And the South remains heavily rural compared to the rest of the country where we're living today. So the cities in North Carolina are slow to develop. And that means the police departments are slow to develop. So remember, I started talking about this with large police departments, or police departments in Raleigh. The Raleigh Police Department really isn't founded till right around 1900. For the first 100 years of the history of Raleigh, there is no police department. When these police departments come into existence, late 1800s in most places, early 1900s in a few others, it is a time of great political corruption in the United States. It is what is called the Gilded Age. And these cities are run by what are called political machines. These are often under the influence of a single man or a group of men who, through various corrupt means, like bribery and extortion and theft, run the cities. So we could talk about the Boss Tweed gang in New York City if you want, but pretty much that's how cities were run. So it's not a surprise that the police departments that grew up were a reflection of the political organization inside these cities. They did a lot of things that you wouldn't think police departments would do. So this first time in the police, these early police departments were really based upon patronage. By the middle part of the 1800s, we have 1838, we have Boston, New York City comes shortly afterwards, but these are political organisms. So an example would be, and this shocks many of my students, police departments in the 1800s actually ran soup kitchens. They ran transient motels for people. They assisted people getting jobs outside of the police department. They also hired people inside the police department. And that's because they were tied to the political machine. The machine got reelected by helping people, and those people voted for it. And it was a symbiotic relationship. This meant that very often we would call the police corrupt. They were so close to the politics and to the people that the boundary between the civilian population, policing, law enforcement was very blurry. So it was not at all unusual to have people get elected, fire large numbers of the police department because a new party came and took over, hire all their boys to run it, and those police departments had very little formal training. They had uniforms, they had jobs, they had a pension maybe, but very little training. In the beginning, 1829, of the 19th century in England, Sir Robert Peel, who was a member of Parliament, was called upon to create the world's first modern police department. Now, Peel's police, the Metropolitan Police of London, are the first recognized police department. And, they still exist today. And, there's even a nod to Robert Peel. Robert's nickname was Bob. Policemen in England are called bobbies. Sometimes they're even called peelers, believe it or not, P-E-E-L-E-R-S. But Peel thought, and this becomes a strong trend, that he wanted to use less force. England had gone through a period where, in order to control the country, they had to call the army into the cities a couple times and read the Riot Act, literally. Peel wanted to avoid this, and he wanted to decrease overt violence. He wanted people to say, well, the army's for fighting foreigners, but the police, that's us. The police are the public, and the public are the police. And the police shouldn't have to use violence to control society, because society should respect the police, and the police should respect society. Now, in one of these micro lectures for this chapter, I'll talk a little bit more about Sir Robert Peel and his rules. But suffice it to say that this was an idealized system that Americans took, along with this sort of graft and crime and political cronyism that was going on, and applied it. So the police were supposed to be a little less violent, even though they often were. They were supposed to be better identified with the people, which they very much were. The police departments and the general public merged in many ways. Now, many people thought that there was a lot of problems with this patronage model. So a reform model was pushed. People like Auguste Volmer and others, Chief of Police of Berkeley, California, argued that we had to professionalize the police. We're going to change the police from being political hirees into true professionals. And we're going to trust the chiefs of police to do this. We're going to take the chiefs of police, and they're going to run their departments. It's not going to be run by the mayor. One of the ways you're going to make it more professional is you're going to improve working conditions. You're going to give them better salaries. Ultimately, you're going to hire more people that look like the public. At first, this was, you're going to hire people that aren't, just white male Protestants. You're going to start hiring the Irish, the Italians. Ultimately, you're going to hire women. You're going to hire minorities. Also, we're going to draw a harder line. We're not going to do things like run soup kitchens. We're not going to do things like being engaged with the public. We're just going to investigate crime. And that's going to separate us from the corruption. And this reform lasted about 40 years. If you want some dates, it runs from about 1920 is really the beginning. It really gets going. A little bit earlier than that, but 1920 is a good date to start with. To about 1960, 1970, somewhere in there. At this point, it becomes obvious that by separating the police from the public, there were some serious problems. Because the police didn't understand what was going on sometimes. And the population that was being policed, the cities, didn't support their police departments. And this was evident in the 1960s when you had race riots in the American South and you had protests against the Vietnam War, and the police were caught really unaware. Um, they didn't have the public support. And this still can be a major problem in the United States. Um, if you go to certain areas of Los Angeles, the LAPD is not widely respected. It's not seen as their police department. It's seen as an occupying army. In departments like Philadelphia was somewhat notorious for this under a chief of police called Rizzo, later mayor of the city, where the police were very heavy-handed and they broke a few heads, and the result of which is they had very little support. Now, you can maintain control by kicking ass and taking names, but you don't get a lot of cooperation, and it's difficult to solve crimes if you don't have the support of the public. So the community area, which I would say lasts from about 1970-ish to about 9/11, somewhere in there, okay? So it really, about a 40-year period or so in which we start to focus on getting the police more involved in the public again, kind of going back to Sir Robert Peel's approach. However, nothing lasts forever. We are in a constant cycle with the police of, okay, we're going to draw away from the public, not be engaged, that'll keep us professional. Oh wait, we can't control crime, let's be engaged with the public. Oh wait, that made us more corrupt, let's pull back. So it's a cycle between we can be professionals and just control crime, or we can be public servants and protect people's rights. So there's no perfect system, because times change, peoples change, so it shouldn't be surprising that police departments are forced to change, adopt different mechanisms, different processes. Okay, after 9/11 we have, I would say, really a new emerging era. We have less of the community policing, more emphasis on intelligence-led. We're going to talk about what that is. Policing, focus against terrorism, application of technology. So many law enforcement experts will tell you that 9/11 ended community policing as we know it. And we shifted more to counterterrorism and greater surveillance of the population. Less interest in due process, more interest in crime control. Certainly, gathering up data becomes very important in the 21st century. So let me give you an example practically of this. The kind of gut thinking, and you often would hear, you'd see it in bad TV shows all the time, my gut tells me that this guy did this crime, the police officer says. Well, the kind of gut thinking about much of street crime, think crimes like, say, rape, certain types of rape, was that a rapist, in order to not be recognized, would leave where he lived and worked, and would commit his crime someplace where if he came into the community, he couldn't be recognized. That's why you would often hear people say, well, have you seen any strangers in the neighborhood when the police investigate crime? That was a very common question. It's the wrong question to ask, because in Montreal, they did a very broad study. This was in the latter half of the 20th century. And they looked at rapists, and one of the things they found is that people who are going to commit rape do not go very far from where they live and work. They operate not in the sort of what your gut tells you common sense, but more like a predator operates, a lion in the savannah. They have a narrow geographical territory they operate in. It's where they're comfortable, where they think they know where everything is, where they think their people are. So the idea of that sort of the bad stranger coming in, convenient myth, doesn't help you solve crime. Knowing that if a rape occurred, you would say, okay, let's draw a circle around where this rape happened, and let's focus our efforts finding that rapist inside the circle. Let's not go to other people's neighborhoods. Let's not ask the question, have you seen a stranger? Let's ask the question, hey, have you seen anybody in the neighborhood that lives here that was out that night. Don't even want to know if they're committing a crime, just want to know if they're here. Okay, so 9/11 allowed trends that already existed to be exploited. Don't let a good crisis go unexploited. Um, there were many inside the police department, many inside law enforcement that thought it was time to get tough, that the community policing, the softer model of policing, wasn't any good. And to be fair about this, the public was willing to surrender much of its freedom, much of its liberty for more security. We were going to make sure that 9/11 never happened again. There was never going to be another terrorist attack. And if we had to give up the right to the government that they could read our emails or track our iPhones, so be it. So you saw an increase in online surveillance. Let's move this out of the United States for 1 second. If you've ever been to London, one of the most amazing things about London, first of all, it's a very large city, very friendly city in many ways too, is there are dozens and dozens and dozens of cameras all over the place in London, on the street corner, monitoring the city. They're just perched up on poles or they're on buildings and they're shooting a scene. So if a crime occurs in the greater London area, the odds of it being caught on video are extremely good. But what that does mean is 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, people in London are being videotaped by the police. Not with a warrant, not with anything, just because they're going about their business and walking around. And people have been willing to accept that because the perception is lowers crime. Okay, so intelligence policing, behavior is not as random as we might think. I'll give you a practical example, and this one again from overseas. A police officer in Milan, Italy, did an analysis of robberies that were occurring at pharmacies. Now, pharmacies in Italy and in Milan, they don't just sell drugs and stuff. They're a lot like convenience stores. They have lots of things. You can cash checks there. You can do all sorts of things. They're kind of a neighborhood service. So this police officer gathered up all the statistical data and crunched all the numbers and said, okay, these are when these types of crime occur. We don't need a randomized patrol to go by there at 2 in the afternoon because almost no robbery occurs at 2 in the afternoon. We need a focus patrol to go by there every 15 minutes between 11 and 1 because that's when the robberies occur. By understanding when the crime occurred, where the crime occurred, so they predicted the future, they were able to lower robberies of pharmacies by 50% within 2 years. That's a dramatic increase, and that's intelligence-led policing. So, using technology like enhanced reality or artificial intelligence, pattern learning, and computers all increase the capabilities of the police. So in the United States today, we see computer systems like CompStat in New York City in particular, which is really geographical mapping of crime, profiling, which was a little bit earlier and is not perhaps as good as we thought it might have been. All these have big applications. All right, terrorism is something else that we've had to deal with. Counterterrorism, fighting terrorism, raises a lot of interesting questions. How much of your resources do you focus on combating terrorism? Is terrorism a crime, or is it something else? I mean, I know it's an evil act, I know it's a bad act, but if we say, okay, this terrorist group is going to fly a plane into the Twin Towers, that's a horrific act, that's an act of terror, but is it a crime? Should law enforcement be handling this, or should it be external, CIA, National Security Agency, military intelligence? Is it a crime? Is it somehow different than every other crime? So how much resources do you want to focus on that? I mean, Raleigh has about 600-700 officers that work for Raleigh. Should we assign counter-terrorists for Raleigh? Is there a terrorist threat in Raleigh? How many? What percentage of your budget do you want to spend on it? You also have to deal with crimes that have international implications. And how do you gather up information? Some of this can be issues like language. Okay, if you think that terrorists are going to be coming in from Portugal, we'll say, I'll make up a country here, not make up a country, make up a terrorist threat. How many police officers in Raleigh speak Portuguese? Not many. Well, what are you going to do? So the application of counterterrorism, particularly to external threats, can be very difficult. There's lots of things to think about. And you also have to think, has there ever been a terrorist threat in Raleigh? And if the answer is, well, there was a guy that had some guns and but is he a foreigner? Is this foreign or domestic that you're dealing with? Because that's another separation. Foreign terrorism tends to unite Americans in the face of a foreign threat. Domestic terrorism is evidence of divide. So, quick example here, you all remember Charlottesville in Virginia a couple years ago, where there were a bunch of idiots running around screaming, white power, Jews will not replace us, basically Nazis. And it was a fairly large meeting. They did a torchlight parade, and one of the participants used his car to run over and kill a protester. Okay, this is domestic terrorism. And what does that show you? Those weren't foreigners coming in. Those were Americans coming out saying, I don't like this group. I don't like Jews. I don't like blacks. I don't like whatever. And actually committing acts of violence against those groups. That means there's a divide inside America. Now, most terrorist organizations in the United States are domestic. They're not foreign. And most of them are right-wing organizations. Most of the groups that commit acts of terror, not all, but most, are right-wing. Probably the longest lasting, even though it's really 2 or 3 organizations, not one, is the Ku Klux Klan. We also have to ask, when does excessive or illegal civilian action or police behavior become like terrorism? When does what are people doing, when do we say it's terrorism? When does protests like Occupy Wall Street or Antifa become terrorism itself? And what's the line between your First Amendment rights of protest and assembly and the right of the state to protect itself? So domestic terrorism, in the past we've had many domestic terrorist organizations. We've had left-wing organizations, the Weathermen Underground, the Unabomber, one can argue, but also the KKK. So in micro lecture 4.2, which you can check out if you want, I'll talk about some domestic terrorist threats and some organizations, give you a little historical context for all this. All right, now we're going to turn to something a little bit more concrete. We're going to talk about law enforcement. We're going to talk about the actual police departments. So what do you have to be a cop? Here are your basic requirements. You have to be a U.S. citizen to be a police officer. You shouldn't have any felony convictions. You have to have a driver's license. You have to meet certain weight and height requirements. Eyesight as well. You got to be 21 years of age. Now there are other conditions. I'll mention a quick one in a second. There's going to be some background checks to make sure and some testing. Very often there's educational. So what other conditions might there be? Well, I'm very familiar with the Raleigh Police Department's training facility. Taught there for Wake Tech for years. And one of the things to become a Raleigh cop that they will do is they will run a credit check to see, okay, is this individual credit worthy? Why would that be a factor? Well, think about it. If you had someone that couldn't handle cash or was in heavy debt and really, really needed money, they might be very susceptible to something like a bribe. So that would be a red flag to get a job. And obviously things like driver's license, they'll do a background check. How many speeding tickets do you have? The more you have, the less likely you get hired. Educational requirements. Now, the Raleigh Police Department, as an example again, you cannot be promoted above the rank of master officer, which is kind of analogous to a corporal, if you do not have at least a 2-year degree. And if you look at the Raleigh Police Department, almost everybody that is sergeant and above has a 4-year degree. And there's a fair number of the majors and captains that have masters, and across the United States it is not uncommon to have chiefs of police with PhDs. So educational requirements are there. We also look for things like, very often, past military experience, seen as a plus. Okay, so training, what happens? You want to be a cop, all right? So you typically will go through a formal training. Now, for the larger police departments, again, we'll use Raleigh as our example here, there is a training academy. For smaller organizations, like say a small police department, they might not have the money to have an academy, so they often will kind of farm that out. Wake Tech runs a BLET, Basic Law Enforcement Training Program, whereby a police department, say like Garner or Fuquay, could sponsor someone to go through BLET, and at the end of that they would have gotten a sort of academy training. So this academy training is paramilitary instruction. Everybody's got a rank, everybody's got a haircut, everybody wears a uniform. You're going to learn the essentials of law enforcement in a very controlled, militarized environment. You're going to be taught the laws of search and seizure, arrest, how to interrogate. You're going to be taught basically weapons, first aid, self-defense. You're going to be taught a lot of the academics. When that's over, you're going to go to work in Fuquay, or if you graduate from the Raleigh Police Department, when you graduate from the academy, you're going to be a rookie. And they're going to assign you an FTO, a Field Training Officer. He's going to be a more senior officer who's going to take your theoretical knowledge that you learned in the academy, or at the BLET at Wake Tech, because we run the program, and tell you how it works on the street. So it's the more practical side of things. All right, a little bit about women and minorities in policing today. In the last 20 years or so, we have seen an increase in the number of minorities working in police departments. If you went back in our time machine 50 years to the 1960s or 1970s, I guess now, and you looked at the Raleigh Police Department, or the Wake County Sheriff's Department, or Garner or Fuquay, you would notice that it's almost exclusively white males. By the time you fast forward today, you're going to find lots of African Americans that work in Raleigh, Hispanics, Asian Americans, women, other minorities. And there's reasons for this. Since the 1970s, law enforcement agencies have made an effort to recruit more people so that their agencies look like the people they're policing. Remember what Sir Robert Peel said, the people are the police and the people, and the police are the people. It's difficult for me if I was, if I was a Bangladesh minority and the police department was all Japanese, right? How can I, as a Bangladeshi, identify with a Japanese person? So, or think about it in a more sensitive sense. Let's suppose you have a rape victim. A woman's been raped. And do you think that it would be easier for a rape victim to report and deal with and provide information to the police if she could talk to a female? Or if, someone who was a victim of a race crime could talk to some other race, or someone that was ethnically different could speak in their own native language. So, because there was past discrimination in an attempt to kind of level the field, we've had a little affirmative action. So what's affirmative action? Well, the first thing is you set a minimum requirement. Nobody can have a job if they can't do it. So you're never going to hire anybody under affirmative action who is unqualified. So you have to reach a raw number at first. Then, if you have a pool of candidates, you say, okay, we want to diversify our police department. So let's suppose you have 100 candidates that apply for slots in the Raleigh Police Department. You say, you know, we're policing a lot of Hispanics. Now, we need people that identify with or speak Spanish, and not the Spanish of high school. Nobody needs to know where, you know, nobody, ¿Dónde está la biblioteca? You don't need to know where the library is. You need to know who's got the gun. Okay? So if you had in that pool of candidates, maybe some candidates that scored lower than some of the others, but they had a unique skill. They had a unique qualification. They were fluent Spanish speakers. Then you might give them more points. Now, this is not a terribly popular program. It's been under a lot of close scrutiny by the courts. It's been under attack. It's still around, but it's not as strong as it used to be. Okay, let's talk about women. Very often women in law enforcement feel they have to prove themselves. Male officers inside police departments will sometimes feel that women are mentally soft, physically weak, and not suited for the job. And then there can be the idea, well, the only reason you got hired is it was a diversity hire. And of course, this can create negative attitudes. Now, what we know is that after having police officers, women police officers for more than 50 years, in a fairly wide scale, we know there's very little effective difference in qualifications and performance between men and women. So doesn't mean that these things don't still exist, the scrutiny, this tokenism, but it does mean that there's very little basis in fact for it. Race can be another problem. Minority officers can be viewed by the departments with some suspicion. So they believe, you know, let's suppose we've got white police officers and we've got a black minority officer. The white police officer might think, well, they're going to cut favors for other blacks. And of course, minority officers will face hostility from members of their own community. They can be perceived as Uncle Toms or traitors. Let me talk a little bit about, so I mentioned gender and I mentioned race. Let me talk a little bit about BTK. In the 1970s, there was a serial killer who was operating, I believe it was in Indianapolis, if I'm not mistaken. He was called BTK, Bind, Torture, Kill. And his prey was in the homosexual community, in the gay community in the area. Now, the police department in Indianapolis was virulently homophobic. They would out gay men. They would arrest them for little or no cause. They would raid their parties. They would raid their bars. They would report them. It was against the law. Often this would result in gay men getting fired or having disruptions in their lives. So there was a great deal of animosity between these two groups. And when it became evident that there was a serial killer stalking gay men, the police department went to leaders of the gay community and said, we need your cooperation. And they got very little. And the reason was they didn't trust them. And that meant that the killer was able to operate longer, kill more people, because there was this distrust between the majority group and the minority group. And this could be repeated in any number of diverse groups. We could be talking about a group that doesn't trust Asian Americans, or I have a friend that is a police officer in the Dakotas, and it might be you have a police department that doesn't trust Native Americans. The better your community relationship is, the better you are at solving crimes and preventing crimes. So diversity of police, at least in theory and somewhat in practice, I think, enables you to detect and solve crimes. There's not a lot of direct empirical evidence for this, and I think this is, if you want to write a major paper someday, you know, and you want to ruffle some feathers, sure, write a paper and ask, does it really make sense to diversify police departments? All right, public law enforcement, some numbers. Let's look at some of this. There's about 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States. They employ over 1 million people. Almost 900,000 of those are sworn law enforcement. Obviously, there's a lot of support people like call-in radio, emergency response units, things like that. They operate on three basic levels: the local level, the state level, and the federal level. Okay, so the vast bulk are at this first two, municipal and sheriffs. So we'll use analogies, or we'll use examples here. Most officers with arrest powers work in small or medium-sized police departments. So Raleigh would be a medium-sized police department, almost verging on the large side now, I guess would be fair to say. There's a lot of, if you think about between the two largest cities in North Carolina, that's Raleigh and Charlotte. And if you drive 40, you'll run into a couple large towns. You'll run into Greensboro, Winston-Salem, but you'll run across a lot of small towns like Elon, and that's where the bulk of law enforcement work. You also have sheriffs. There's 100 counties in North Carolina. There's 100 different sheriff's departments, and they do all sorts of things. They investigate crimes. They also maintain jails. They do a lot of civil work. They collect taxes. In North Carolina, they're responsible for courtroom security. We also have, and now different states use this in different ways, medical examiners or county coroners. I'm not going to talk too much about that. Okay, so large cities, the Raleigh Police Department; smaller towns, Fuquay-Varina. That's municipal law enforcement. County would be Wake County Sheriff's Department, or pick your county, Mecklenburg or New Hanover. North Carolina has a mix of the coroners. We have 9 counties that have elected coroners, and medical examiners are part-time appointed county workers. That system's pretty messy, and we could spend an entire class talking about the problems with the coroner system in the United States. Okay, the state level. States are either a unified system or a split system. So in North Carolina, what we have done is we have divided it up. And in about half the states, you're going to have something like the North Carolina Highway Patrol and the SBI, the State Bureau of Investigation, being separate entities. In about 23 or 25 of the rest of the states, they unify those two things. So if you go to Pennsylvania, there is no Pennsylvania Highway Patrol. There's the Pennsylvania State Police. They do the same type of investigations that SBI do, and they also do the same type of road patrol that the Highway Patrol does. This is this slide here, the current structure, and I'm going to let you look at that as much as you want, of the North Carolina Department of Public Safety. And you can see all the different divisions there and actually who's working in them. Budget, operations, administration, juvenile justice, there's just a ton of them there. Law enforcement, alcohol law enforcement. Okay, the feds. Federal employees do not make up the largest part of law enforcement. They're probably less than 20%, maybe 10%. But you've got some big departments. You've got things like Custom and Border, Immigration, Secret Service, Coast Guard, TSA, and FEMA. Those are all under Homeland Security, but the premier agency is going to be the FBI. Here's a listing of others. Some of them should be a surprise to you, some of them not. You've got Criminal Investigation Division, that's U.S. Army SID. You got CIS, which is Naval, NCIS, Naval Criminal Investigation. You got the Postal Service, Secret Service, Federal Protective Service, FBI. All those exist as federal agencies. The biggest one, the most important one, the most famous one is the FBI. That is under the Department of Justice. There was a big political fight, and whether Homeland Security should get all law enforcement or not, and the Department of Justice, which is run by the Attorney General of the United States, won. And they kept control of the FBI. So you got FBI, you also have DEA, ATF, and the U.S. Marshal Service. You also have some specialty ones inside the Treasury Department. The IRS has its own police agency. They have some IRS agents carry guns. The final large group to talk about here is private security. Um, if there's 1 million and a few more people in public, almost 900,000 of them being sworn officers, there's more than 2 million working in the private sector as law enforcement. And there's reasons for this. In theory, you privatize law enforcement and it is possibly more efficient. And you will see secondary policing, you'll see police officers take job as private law enforcement. Part of this is based on fear of crime. You cannot turn on TV and fail to see a ad for home monitoring. And that's selling you fear. That's saying you got to be careful. People are going to break into your house. You also have the problem of crime in the workplace. You also have the Americans don't want to spend a lot of money. So there's pressure to cut budgets, including police budgets, but there's also a desire for public services. So the awareness is, well, a few rich people could pay for a few good cops for themselves, cheaper than they could pay broad taxes to pay for everybody's cop. All right, about 50 minutes. That's where I want to hold it to, about 50 minutes to an hour there. And we'll pick up with Chapter 5 in the next unit. Until then, have a good night, everybody.